everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the astrological chart of Janis Joplin. I've been wanting to do her chart for a long time, and somebody recently asked me to look at it, and I jumped at the chance because I was trying to figure out who to do next. And way back when, I read a bunch of books on Janis Joplin's life. One of them was written by her female partner. Janis Joplin was actually a bisexual. I wonder how many people know that. And I don't know if it was her girlfriend who said this or somebody else, but they said that Janis loved men and women equally. And I think the implication was that if you're bisexual, you probably favor one gender over the other. But in any case, there was one book that was from her younger sister who would receive letters from Janis while Janis was, away from home. And she collected these letters and then provided some other background information coming from the same family as Janis. And it was just very nice to have that other perspective. I think it was called Letters to Janis or something like that. But those were very good books. And then there was at least one other book that I read on her life. And Janis was born in a place called Port Arthur, Texas, and grew up there. And as I recall, it had like an oil refinery, or it was near it. And so you could take from that it was kind of maybe a working class town. I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think it was a very affluent area. And as often happens with those kinds of areas, they tend to be quite conservative. And when I say conservative, I'm not talking about political affiliation. I'm talking about the attitudes do not really allow for anything other than the standard way of living, dressing, being. And this was, I think, one of the things that plagued Janis is that she was ahead of her time. She had a very strong Aquarian signature in her chart because even though her sun sign was in Capricorn, it was at 28 degrees. So it was, pretty much on the cusp of Aquarius. And then she had Mercury in Aquarius. She had Venus in Aquarius, and she had Aquarius rising. Now, as a lot of you probably know, the rising sign can determine the appearance of the person. So somebody with Aquarius rising is going to be quite distinctive in how they look because they want to be distinctive. They want to stand out. Not like their opposite sign of Leo that wants to be at the center of attention. They just want to be a nonconformist. They don't want to be a carbon copy of somebody else. So Janis Joplin's appearance was very distinctive, and she created her own image. If you ever see pictures of her, yes, there's that hippie chic. She would have people make costumes for her, and I actually think she had a girlfriend. I'm talking about like a friend who was very who could sew and who would sew her handmade items, or she knew somebody, I think, that she would go to for these one of a kind type of items. And if you see some of these photographs of her, you can see how she had they're kind of bohemian types of clothing, maybe like some bell bottoms. And you have to remember that this was the 60s, and bell bottoms were around, but they became much more commonplace in the early 70s. And I'm not saying that, nobody ever wore bell bottoms in the 60s. That's silly, but I just feel like it was very distinctive that she had that. And she also had boas and feathers. I mean, she had that whole kind of a vibe going that's very bohemian and kind of almost, in that hippie vibe. But Janis wasn't really a hippie. That's the funny thing about it. She was kind of like, how they say about men from Texas that they're good old boys. She was kind of a good old girl. She did have this tendency to be more of, like, in terms of her drug of choice, alcohol, depressants like alcohol, and unfortunately heroin, because that's what took her life. Although I think it was a mixture of things. I think she also took downers like, barbiturates or something like that, sleeping pills or whatever, rather than psychedelics. As I recall, she did try acid, but it scared her or something like that. She didn't have like a good trip, even though she hung with these people in the Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco. I'm assuming it was in Haight-Ashbury, but she was associated with San Francisco, because that's where she formed that band called Big Brother and the Holding Company. And of course the Grateful Dead were from there, and there were a whole set of bands that were from San Francisco in that era of the 60s, like the mid-60s, including Jefferson Airplane and things like that. The Doors were from California, but they were from Southern California. So she actually went to California before that period of time. She went to California, namely Long Beach, which I think is around San Francisco, so it's more in the northern part of the state, around 1960 or early 60s, and she had a bad experience there. She got involved with meth. I think she was shooting meth, and she eventually had some kind of a breakdown or psychosis or something, and she came home. Now, like I said, I read those books a long time ago. I think that she was probably playing coffee houses. You have to remember that in the early 60s, this was before the hippies were a mainstream thing. And the alternative community in those days were the beatniks, and they were coming from the late 50s. They were the ones who started that coffee house craze and the folk music, and you could say jazz too, and things like that. But they were into poetry readings. You have like Allen Ginsberg and people like that. And so I'm assuming that she was doing the coffee house scene and she got involved in drugs. She got really scared. She got scared straight. When she got home and she recovered, she tried to live on the straight and narrow. She put her hair up in a bun or something conservative. She wore conservative white, dress shirts and skirts, rather than being kind of that tomboy that she was. And she went and worked as a secretary or something like that. I can't remember, but I don't even remember how long she did that. But she was really like freaked out by what had happened to her. So she was trying to, kind of put that behind her. But of course, that wasn't her destiny, was to live that straight lifestyle. So she eventually went back to California, this time to San Francisco, and the rest is history. Now, with the sun in Capricorn and the moon in Cancer, this type of person can be quite traditional in many ways. The rising sign is not who the person really is. It's a part of themselves, but it's not who they really are. And so that means that it was kind of like the persona that she projected was this individual who was kind of um, rebellious, not the traditional type of woman. And this was one of the things that always plagued her, was the fact that she was not like other girls. And I can't remember why. I mean, I always thought she was sexy, pretty. She didn't, and she didn't tend to wear a lot of makeup, but she had like a natural look. Those Capricorn women who are very kind of down to earth and stuff like that. But for whatever reason, she wasn't like this conventional type of woman. She may have had kind of a masculine vibe with all these masculine signs, and then dressed the part. And so other people couldn't handle that. It's like when you are artistic in a small town, where the people might tend to be kind of narrow-minded. And what people can realize is that their higher self may be choosing these experiences for them to expand, so that they rebel against that and they can help other people in that community to be exposed to something different. It's so unfortunate these days that it's always emphasized all the bigotry, and they don't emphasize, hey, by this experience happening, this is going to advance the cause. Like, that's going to energetically make those people more open-minded, just by virtue of somebody who is willing to go against the grain. And so in those days, Janis was just not like that. And she couldn't pull it off, that being a traditional girl, being a traditional young lady. She just was too much her own person. But she did eventually embrace her differences when she formed that band, and she became very much what we would call a trendsetter. And that's when you have Aquarius rising, you're very ahead of your time. So the way that you dress can be what other people end up dressing like maybe 5 years later. And certainly that was the case with Janis. If you look at footage from Woodstock, which was in August of 1969, and you see the attendees, the people who attended Woodstock, you will see a lot of people with short hair, a lot of people with very straight clothing. It wasn't until the early 70s that men really did grow out their hair. And I remember that as a kid. But in the 60s, even the people attending Woodstock, a lot of them did not look like freaks. They looked pretty on the straight and narrow, which is kind of interesting. So it takes time for these things to filter down into suburbia. And so Aquarius is the sign of the person who is a trendsetter because they're futuristic. And Aquarius is a masculine sign, so if a woman has Aquarius as her rising sign, she may be more of a tomboy. It's not going to be that way across the board. But for Aquarius, if the societal norms are like women wear skirts, because when Janis she was born in like 1943. So that means she would have graduated high school probably around 1961. If you ever see any kind of film from the early 60s, you would think that you were in the middle of the 50s. It kind of like carried on until the early 60s before the fashions changed. So a woman who was from that era would have been expected to wear dresses or skirts. And I can't remember what Janis wore, but I think she was very much, like I said, kind of a tomboy. She might have worn pants, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm talking about regularly. Obviously, even then, girls would have pants, but it was not like it is now. It was not very common to do stuff like that. So then, she joined the band and she was doing her thing, and that's that Capricorn, the Mars in the 10th house of really grabbing, 10th house can be fame, and so it could be somebody who's really trying to go for it and trying to get as famous as possible. Now, what I want to talk about are the inner planets that she has in the 12th house. She has a stellium here. She has 3 planets in the 12th. I did not know this before. And I believe that Freddie Mercury had the sun in the 12th house also. And he was very flamboyant as a singer. Usually what they say is that if somebody has the sun in the 12th house, they're going to be very, I wouldn't say like isolated, but just very maybe inhibited, or they love solitude, things like that. It's possible that Freddie Mercury liked his alone time, and I definitely think that Janis did, just based on what I remember, that she liked to read. She liked to have these quiet pursuits. She wasn't just all about being a party animal or anything like that. But the 12th house is a house of self-undoing. And this is a house of addiction, because this is a house of Pisces, and Pisces ruler is Neptune, and Neptune is can be about drugs. It's also about spiritual ecstasy or, communion. So these are the things. And if you think about it, that is sometimes what drives somebody to take drugs. Even a drug like heroin that is not considered a mind-expanding type of drug. It's really something that puts people into this kind of a stupor, or it kind of limits consciousness. It doesn't expand it. But because it does have that effect of putting them into this kind of a stupor type of state, they're not thinking about their problems or feeling that emotional turmoil, because the 12th house is the house of suffering. It's the house of Pisces, and so therefore that feeling like a victim or also being an empath can be very strong. So probably what it says to me is that Janis was an empathic. And because of that, she was quite sensitive. She could feel the collective soul and the pain of the collective soul. But you see, sometimes when people are very sensitive, they hide it, with this bravado. And I think that's what she did, because if you think about her image, it was, and even it's funny talking about the 10th house, that very, and we look at that as part of the public reputation. With Mars there can be this sense of the drama that's associated with some of these stars. I think about Jim Morrison. That was kind of her male counterpart. And she did have encounters with Jim Morrison, actually. I don't know if they went to bed together. But they definitely had this kind of, I think she hit him over the head with a wine bottle or something. I can't remember. But this idea of being controversial or being wild, I think of Mars in the 10th like that. But anyway, she had the sun in the 12th house. She had Mercury here, and that could have made her very psychic and intuitive, but also maybe identifying as a victim, seeing herself in a light of the negative things that had happened to her, rather than seeing that everything is happening for a reason. And that's kind of the irony or the contradictory part of the 12th house, is that when you have planets here, and these are all personal planets that she had here, but when you have planets here, this is supposed to be the place of spiritual wisdom and things like that, and transcendence. But sometimes it can be a person who's their own worst enemy, and who has kind of, so to me, it's almost like a limited consciousness when it comes to who they are, and they see themselves in that victim role. And that's very disempowering. But that, let me see, she did have a couple of hard angles from the sun to Jupiter and then to Pluto. And so that could also point to perhaps when your sun is afflicted, it can affect the way that you view yourself, but also the way that you promote yourself. And with I was gonna say, with the opposition to Jupiter, it could be like delusions of grandeur. I have this too. I have this too. Delusions of grandeur. Because Jupiter is very, expansive, but this is a hard angle, so the person has this inflated view of themselves. And then with the sun opposing Pluto, there can be this rebellion against someone who is trying to control them. And really with this especially, the person may be trying to keep them from being creative, because the sun is that creative force. And so they may sense that someone doesn't want them to really be that individual. And it can be very oppressive. Like I have a square, which is more like a blockage. So somebody trying to block your light. But in this case, it's going to have a similar kind of a theme where, and this makes that person want to rebel, because, with oppositions, there is the projection onto others. And maybe that would affect future relationships. So an example would be, let's say that you are artistic and you have a parent who wants you to become a lawyer, and you want to be a rock star, or you want to be a rapper. I don't know, maybe a rock star is kind of a old-fashioned term, but let's say you want to be a rapper, or I don't know, something that's not what everybody wants you to be, or the authority figures want you to be. And so you're fighting for your right to be creative, and they're trying to keep you down, but you take that type of rebellion and you apply it everywhere. And sometimes it may be wrong. You may be misunderstanding a situation because you're so invested in opposing things, and feeling like everybody's just trying to keep you from being that creative force, when in fact they might be challenging you, or they might be, trying to get you to do other things, to stretch yourself in other ways. Janis had a well-aspected Saturn. That doesn't mean that everything 100% is going to be, perfect in that area. But she had trines from the Sun, from Mercury, and from Venus to Saturn. Especially with the Sun and trine Saturn, it can indicate somebody with good discipline who can reach their goals because they're creating their goals through the Sun and, implementing them. Saturn is the crystallization of goals. It's one thing to have to create goals, but you have to be willing to do what it takes. And some people they can plan for something, but they don't end up implementing it because they don't execute it. And she had a trine from Mercury to Saturn. This is good for concentration. She was a prolific reader. I think she read a lot of literature, I'm not sure. And from Venus to Saturn, this can be very dedicated in relationships. So I wanted to... Oh, okay, speaking of Venus, she had Venus in the 12th. And so what I think, I mentioned her sexuality, and, it goes without saying that I don't think being bisexual would have gone over very well in Port Arthur, but even in San Francisco in the 60s, I mean, even in more progressive areas, this was simply not something that was just very open about. People probably wouldn't understand it in the first place. They'd probably understand homosexuality a lot more than bisexuality, and they might jump to conclusions about what that actually means. So that's one of the things I would say about this position is keeping love secret. The 12th house can be, covert, kind of hidden. And also this can be secret pleasures, which can include, like indulgences that you don't share. And of course, with drug addiction, especially if there are taboos with that, that's going to be something that, like a hidden addiction, that the person doesn't broadcast. Getting drunk was something she could do, and nobody would bat an eyelash, but shooting heroin certainly wouldn't have been very socially acceptable. And so that, heroin is something that somebody would do in private. So that would make sense that would be in the 12th house. In the 3rd house, Janis has Uranus and Saturn. And there you go. There's Uranus again, the ruler of Aquarius, the mind which is very, thinking thoughts ahead of its time, and maybe communicating in a way that other people find hard to understand if they have a more conventional way of thinking. This is going to be a person who's very progressive. And these types of people that have a lot of Uranian energy are, I was going to use the word outraged at the conventional or, conservative way that others think. And so that just provokes more rebellion within them because they think of all of the injustices in life and how dare people treat others that way. And they want to find their tribe. Remember that Uranus and Aquarius rule the 11th house, which is the collective. And so the mind is always kind of futuristic and very, very smart person. Now Janis didn't necessarily showcase her intellect in a way that most people would grasp. You have a certain stereotype of somebody who is smart, wearing glasses, wearing, the way they dress, not wearing feather boas and bell bottoms. That's not what we would associate, or being this wild rock and roller. But she may have been more of a closet intellectual with Mercury in the 12th house. Saturn in the 3rd house, it can be someone who's very serious about her ideas. Also, sometimes, if you have Saturn in the 3rd house, this can indicate that there was some type of delay in learning, speech delay, learning disabilities. We have to remember that any kind of learning disability, like dyslexia, has nothing to do with a person's intelligence. However, if you are in the typical, I would say, public school environment, but even with private schools where there are other children and you are being compared to other children, it can be very traumatic, because you can compare yourself to others and feel like you don't measure up, and you can be treated that way, that you're in the slow readers group or whatever, and that doesn't help a person's self-esteem. That doesn't help them enjoy learning and feeling, all of those things that we want to encourage children to do. I think sometimes, even with Saturn in the 3rd house, the person may suffer from pessimistic thinking. And definitely with that stellium in the 12th, Janis may have been someone who had that sense of victimization, that signature, that, because this is the karmic house, so there may be karmic reasons for a person to be singled out, to be treated in a way that isn't full of respect and acceptance. And I'm not talking about punishment, but the soul chooses to have an experience like that in order to gain more information about maybe what it feels like. And the problem is, when somebody identifies with what they may have chosen, then they feel like the victim, and then they can take over from other people and do that to themselves. And so that's something I should emphasize from the 12th house, is the house of escapism, the house of self-undoing, and maybe self-pity, and then that, drug addiction tends, or I should just say addiction tends to stem from these things and then feed into it. In the 5th house, this is a house of creativity and love, and Janis had the moon and Jupiter, so her creativity is really showcased in this house, because the moon is a creative force. And when you have it in the 5th house, you have to create. You don't even have a choice in the matter. And it also indicates a romantic nature, a person who wants to love and be loved. Jupiter here is all about luck in these endeavors. It can indicate that this is a very emphasized part of a person's life where they are having a lot of love affairs, having a lot of creativity flowing in their life. And let's see here. In the sixth house, it's very interesting because Janis had Pluto here as well as the North Node. And that's really kind of odd because the North, well, first of all, it's not odd that she had the North Node in Leo because she certainly, that is the sign of the performer and that was her destiny. But in the sixth house is service to others. And I would think it would be more like the 10th house, which is kind of like that public and how people see you and things like that. And yet it was in the sixth house. So, how I would interpret this is that it's almost like her soul's mission was to be the servant of entertainment. It was like she was, I can't really articulate it, but it was different. There was a purpose to serve other people in some way. Now, how could that be? Well, when Janis passed away, it was right at the advent of the feminist movement, and that was the feminist movement that I consider to be the organic version that was coming from a genuine, history of women experiencing inequality. And she passed away right at the beginning of that. Maybe she was one of those torchbearers without even, being so in an overt way. I don't know. Anything that celebrates those who are different, those who don't fit in, maybe that was one of her legacies. Pluto here, I feel, is the healer. Anybody who has Pluto in the sixth house is a force of nature as it relates to how they serve other people. And by the same token, if you have Pluto in the sixth house, you have to be careful about how you approach your work environment because this can be the office place. And you don't want to give off the vibe that you are trying to run the joint, that you want to, take over, because that can be a very like overpowering type of an influence. But definitely the healer. In the seventh house, she had Neptune and Chiron. And I think she suffered in love, and I think she wanted that significant other, but something kept her from having that ultimately. I can't remember all the details of her love situations, like whatever happened to that woman who she seemed to have such a strong bond to. I wonder if somebody died that she loved. I can't remember. But anyway, Chiron here can indicate either maybe the person has trouble committing because maybe sometimes people have commitment issues because they are afraid of intimacy or they are afraid of being abandoned, and so they just act in a very detached way so that they can't get hurt, or they just have a very, I was going to say, progressive attitude towards love that other people don't have. Like, the idea of polyamory, free love, which was very prevalent in the 60s, not necessarily successful in all relationships, but with all this Aquarian energy, she just may have been the type of person who could never be in that monogamous type of relationship and felt the pain from it. In this day and age, there is more acceptance for different types of marriages, including open marriages. And also, this can be being cheated on by people. But it can be that somebody comes along who has a healing influence on a person too, so it doesn't have to be all negative. Neptune here can be idealism with love, and sometimes that can lead to disappointment if somebody is overly idealistic and they're not realistic about what love can really do for a person. This is actually about commitment, though, so I shouldn't just make it about love, but this bond. Sometimes it can attract deceptive partners, but it can be the soulmate as well. One last thing that I want to talk about is her Mars in Sagittarius. Sagittarius is a fire sign, and Mars is how we act. In terms of how Janis performed, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, and it has that over-the-top quality, Jupiter. And if you think about how Janis performed for most of her career, it was very flamboyant and very, histrionics. And I really wonder how many people liked that music. If you liked Janis's music, that was very how would I describe it? When she was yelling and stuff like that, please let me know, because I always think that Janis has been immortalized more for her persona than her actual music. But what I remember reading is that people thought that her last album was actually where she was going in the right direction with more soft type of, because she started as a folk singer, and I love that voice of hers. I think she was trying to imitate those blues singers, when she had that voice and she was, really belting it out. And I felt that her folky voice was more authentic, and I certainly enjoyed it. It was very distinctive. So, and to me, very authentic. So that's how I feel about that Mars in Sagittarius. But again, that's another sign that is very freedom loving and adventurous. And she certainly showed that side of herself. So that's what I have on Janis, and I hope that you enjoyed this. If you would like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.